The village of Vervey had always been an isolated place, nestled deep in the shadow of looming mountains. Its people whispered of miracles performed by Saint Belisara, a holy woman whose touch could cure illness and whose sermons filled the faithful with hope. Her shrine stood at the heart of the village, a towering structure of ancient stone adorned with candles and offerings. Yet beneath the surface of reverence lay unease, a gnawing suspicion that few dared voice. The day began with Father Anselm entering the shrine, his hands trembling as he prepared for the morning prayers. A foul stench greeted him, a mixture of decay and something coppery, almost metallic. His footsteps echoed in the empty hall as he moved toward the altar, his breath quickening with every step. "Saint Belisara," he called, his voice quivering. A low whisper answered him, soft and serpentine. "Do you fear me, Father?" He froze, the hairs on his neck rising. The whisper seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Before he could respond, a sudden crash of footsteps thundered behind him. Spinning around, he saw nothing but shadows shifting unnaturally against the walls. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The air grew colder, and he heard the faint sound of chewing, wet, deliberate. A shiver ran down his spine as the sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the room. The villagers gathered later that morning, their faces pale as they discussed the disappearance of young Clara, a girl known for her devotion to Saint Belisara. Her mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching a rosary as the villagers exchanged anxious glances. "We should ask the saint for guidance," one man suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Clara was last seen near the shrine," another muttered, his tone dark. Saint Belisara appeared then, gliding into the square with an otherworldly grace. Her long robes trailed behind her, pristine white despite the mud that clung to the streets. Her face was serene, her eyes radiant with a light that seemed to pierce through the gloom. "My children," she said, her voice a melody that soothed and unsettled in equal measure. "Do not fear. Clara is in the arms of the divine now." The villagers murmured prayers, but Clara's mother wailed louder. Belisara's eyes flickered with something, anger, hunger, but her beatific smile never faltered. Father Anselm could no longer ignore the growing dread that consumed him. That night, he crept back into the shrine armed with a lantern and a knife. The shadows seemed alive, writhing as though they had substance. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he approached the altar. The chewing sound returned, louder now, and accompanied by a sickening squelch. Anselm steeled himself and turned the corner. What he saw made him drop the lantern, plunging the room into flickering darkness. Saint Belisara knelt before the altar, her pristine robe stained crimson as she tore into a human arm, her teeth gnashing through bone with horrifying ease. The remains of Clara lay scattered around her, her lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. "Belisara," he gasped. She turned to him, her mouth smeared with blood, yet her face retained its divine beauty. "Do you judge me, Father?" she asked, her voice calm and soothing. "This is the price of miracles, flesh for the divine, blood for salvation." The next morning, Anselm stood before the villagers, his face pale and drawn. "She is no saint," he declared. "She is a monster who feasts on the flesh of the innocent." The villagers gasped, their faith shaken but not broken. Saint Belisara appeared once more, her presence as radiant as ever. "Father Anselm has been misled by darkness," she said, her voice resonating with authority. "The divine tests us all, and some fail." The villagers hesitated, torn between loyalty to their saint and the horror of Anselm's accusation. Suddenly, a sharp scream echoed through the square. All heads turned to see Clara's mother collapsing to the ground, blood pouring from her mouth. Belisara stepped forward, her eyes alight with an otherworldly glow. "The divine's will is clear. Doubt is a sin." The villagers fell to their knees, their fear outweighing their reason. Anselm stood alone, his resolve hardening as he clutched his knife. That night, the village burned with the glow of torches as Anselm led a small group to the shrine. The air was thick with tension, every creak of wood or rustle of leaves making them jump. Inside, they found Belisara waiting, her hands folded in prayer. The room reeked of blood and the remains of countless victims littered the shadows. "You cannot stop me," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. The divine's hunger is eternal. Anselm lunged at her, his knife aimed at her heart, but Belisara moved with inhuman speed, her hand catching his wrist and twisting until the bones snapped. She screamed, the sound echoing as the villagers watched in horror. Belisara's serene mask cracked, revealing a grotesque visage. Her mouth filled with jagged teeth, her eyes black pits that oozed darkness. She lunged at the nearest villager, tearing into their throat with a savage growl. The room descended into chaos, screams mingling with the wet sounds of flesh being torn apart. Anselm, clutching his broken arm, crawled toward the altar, where a pile of bones glowed faintly. A whisper filled his ears. "Destroy the heart." He looked up to see the faint outline of Clara, her ghostly form pointing toward a pulsating mass hidden beneath the bones. Summoning the last of his strength, Anselm plunged his knife into the heart. Belisara shrieked, her body convulsing as black ichor poured from her wounds. The shrine shook violently, the walls cracking as the divine's presence was banished. The next morning, the villagers found Anselm's body lying before the ruined shrine, his face peaceful despite the horrors he had endured. Belisara was gone, her presence erased as though she had never existed. But deep in the woods, a faint heartbeat echoed, waiting for the faithful to return. As the villagers began to rebuild their lives, the whispers in the forest grew louder. Clara's ghost, once thought to be at peace, reappeared, not as a savior but as something vengeful. Her apparition wandered the woods, her form decayed and eyes hollow, murmuring, "The heart still beats. You didn't finish it." Father Anselm's grave was found disturbed one morning, his body missing. On the crumbled ruins of the shrine, a single bloody handprint marked the altar, larger than any human hand. A faint heartbeat began resonating beneath the earth, louder and louder night after night. In the final moments, the villagers heard a whisper rippling through the air. "I am still here. The flock will grow again." Then came the sound of footsteps, impossibly heavy, marching toward the village. Darkness swept over the land as distant screams echoed from the forest, a new terror awakening. The villagers' nightmare seemed over, but as they ventured deeper into the forest to cleanse the land, they discovered something far worse. Buried beneath the shrine, hidden for centuries, was not a heart but a vast, pulsating organism, an enormous, otherworldly being whose presence corrupted the earth itself. Its veins stretched out like roots, entwined with the soil, feeding off the village. They realized St. Belisara was not its origin but its creation, a mere vessel molded to serve and feed it. As they tried to retreat, Clara's ghost appeared once more, but this time she smiled. Her body twisted unnaturally as she spoke, her voice layered with others. "You thought the heart was mine. You are all my flock now." Suddenly the villagers felt an unbearable pull. Their veins burned as the forest began to consume them. Some fell to the ground, their bodies bursting into saplings that writhed and grew rapidly. Others screamed as black ichor poured from their eyes and mouths, transforming them into grotesque guardians of the organism. In the final twist, one villager found a journal buried near the shrine's ruins. It wasn't written by a priest or a villager, but by the divine itself. The last entry read, "The faithful will always serve. The flock will always return." As the villager looked up, the forest swarmed with glowing eyes. Footsteps thundered around them, closing in as the ground began to breathe. The winter came early that year, howling winds burying the village of Black Hollow under endless snowdrifts. By mid-December, food stores ran low, and the once jovial spirit of the townsfolk turned grim. At the village council meeting, Elder Thorne stood, his weathered face pale as frost. "We must discuss the pact," he began, his voice steady despite the tension rippling through the room. Murmurs broke out, some angry, some fearful. "The pact was for emergencies," protested Miriam, clutching her shawl tightly. "And what is this, if not an emergency?" Elder Thorne countered. "The harvest failed. The game has fled. Without the pact, we die." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. The Pact of Black Hollow was a whispered legend, born during the last great famine generations ago. It was said that a blood offering could stave off starvation, but at what cost? "Do we vote then?" asked Jonah, his gaunt frame hunched in the corner. Thorne nodded solemnly. A rusted ceremonial urn was brought forth, and each villager cast their stone, white for life, black for death. When the urn was emptied, the verdict was clear. "The pact is invoked," Thorne declared, though his voice betrayed a quiver. 2 nights later, in the dead of a blizzard, the chosen family was summoned. The Carters, Jacob, his wife Sarah, and their young daughter Lily, stood trembling at the village square. "Why us?" Jacob demanded, his voice a mix of fury and desperation. "You swore the pact would never return." Elder Thorne avoided his gaze. "It's for the greater good." The words felt hollow. Lily clutched her mother, her wide eyes gleaming with terror. "Please," Sarah sobbed, "she's just a child." The villagers shuffled uneasily, but hunger gnawed away at their humanity. The Carters were led to the cellar beneath the old church, its stone walls damp and cold. Bound and gagged, they were left alone with their fate. Above, the villagers prepared a grim feast. A butcher's table was dragged into the square, knives sharpened with mechanical precision. The air was heavy with dread, mingling with the bitter scent of desperation. The first scream cut through the night like a blade. Jacob fought valiantly, but his strength was no match for the collective will of the starving. As his life ebbed, the villagers carved the flesh from his bones with clinical efficiency. Blood pooled on the snow, steaming in the freezing air. Sarah's turn came next. "You monsters!" She spat through her tears, thrashing against her bindings. Her cries were muffled as the ritual continued. The villagers worked in silence, their faces ghostly in the moonlight, their hands slick with gore. When they reached Lily, a hesitant murmur rippled through the crowd. She looked impossibly small on the butcher's table, her tear-streaked face frozen in silent horror. "She's too young," Jonah whispered, his knife trembling. But hunger had turned compassion to ash. "The pact spares no one," Thorne reminded them, though his voice cracked. As the feast began, the villagers sat in grim silence, the taste of human flesh foreign and bitter. But with each bite, their desperation waned, replaced by a terrible clarity. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. The next morning, the storm broke, and a hunting party found a herd of deer not far from the village. The irony was cruel. In the months that followed, Black Hollow was never the same. The villagers avoided one another's eyes, their shared guilt a festering wound. Strange occurrences plagued the town, shadowy figures flitting through the woods, disembodied whispers in the night. Some claimed to see the Carters' specters, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and rage. And then, one by one, the villagers began to vanish. Elder Thorne was the last. One night, as he sat alone in his cabin, a chilling voice echoed from the shadows. "The pact was meant to protect, not to destroy," it hissed. He turned to see the Carter family, their spectral forms bathed in a ghastly light. "We are the price," they intoned in unison, their voices a haunting melody of despair. The next morning, the village was empty, the snow-covered streets eerily silent. Black Hollow became a ghost town, its dark legacy a cautionary tale for generations to come. Those who dared to visit spoke of faint cries on the wind and red stains that refused to fade from the church cellar. The pact had saved the village once, but at a cost far greater than anyone could have imagined. Months after the village of Black Hollow had faded into obscurity, travelers began to notice something strange. The land surrounding the ghost town seemed unnaturally fertile. Trees grew taller, their branches heavy with fruit. Game animals roamed freely, their coats sleek and healthy. Rumors spread that Black Hollow's soil could turn barren fields into lush paradise. Drawn by whispers of prosperity, a group of settlers arrived to claim the abandoned village. Among them was a young herbalist named Clara. As they rebuilt the town, Clara began to explore its dark history. In the church cellar, she discovered blood-stained carvings on the walls, ancient runes surrounding a crude depiction of a figure kneeling before a great beast. The air in the cellar was thick and oppressive, the silence almost alive. One night, Clara had a dream, or so she thought. In it, a gaunt, spectral figure approached her, its translucent skin stretched tightly over hollow bones. It was Sarah Carter. "You must leave," the ghost whispered, its voice barely audible over the howling wind. "The pact is not broken. It cannot be broken." Clara awoke drenched in sweat, the taste of iron lingering on her tongue. Days later, Clara noticed a disturbing trend. Animals in the forest began to vanish. First, the deer, then the birds, until even the insects disappeared. One morning, she found a pile of bones near the edge of the village, fresh, gnawed clean, and arranged in a perfect circle. She brought her findings to the settlers, but they dismissed her as paranoid. The night of the Harvest Festival, a chilling fog rolled into Black Hollow. As the villagers gathered in the square, the church bell tolled on its own, each peal louder than the last. Clara felt a deep rumble beneath her feet, as if something ancient was stirring. Then the earth split open. From the fissure emerged a grotesque creature, its body a shifting mass of flesh and bone pulsating with unnatural life. It bore no face, only mouths, hundreds of them gnashing and moaning. "The debt must be paid," it growled, its voice a cacophony of human and inhuman sounds. The settlers scattered in terror, but Clara stood frozen. In the creature's shifting form, she saw familiar faces: Jacob, Sarah, and Lily Carter. Their hollow eyes stared back at her, their mouths opening in silent screams. The creature lunged, consuming one villager after another. Clara fled to the cellar, where she frantically tried to decipher the runes on the walls. She realized too late that the pact had not been a simple sacrifice. It was a binding contract. The villagers of Black Hollow had promised not just their lives, but their very souls. And now, the debt was due. As the creature descended into the cellar, its many voices harmonizing into a dreadful wail, Clara picked up a blade from the altar. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the face of a child staring back from the creature's mass. Lily, her lips moving to form the words, "It's your turn now." Black Hollow vanished from maps soon after. The land, once lush, became barren, and those who ventured too close swore they could hear whispers on the wind. The pact is eternal. The mortuary sat silent except for the storm raging outside. Victor Crane's breath fogged in the frigid air, the faint scent of formaldehyde clinging to every surface. He held the matchstick between trembling fingers, the weak flame dancing as he scanned the room.
"Clara!"
he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the howling wind that clawed at the windows. He stumbled toward the slab where her body had lain moments ago, only to find the pristine sheet crumpled, streaked with blood. A single drop of red splattered onto the floor with a faint patter, as if taunting him. His heart thundered in his chest, louder than the storm itself. The silence was broken by a low chant, guttural and rhythmic, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound pressed against his skull, a sinister hymn that made the shadows stretch and writhe like living things. His eyes darted around the room, desperate to find the source, but there was only darkness. Then he heard it, a faint rustling like leaves scraping across stone, followed by the unmistakable creak of floorboards. His pulse quickened as the noise grew louder, coming closer, accompanied by the sound of chains dragging across wood. "Clara, if this is you, I'm not afraid," he shouted, his voice breaking. The echoing whisper that followed seemed to mock him, repeating his words in a distorted cadence. Not afraid. He turned toward the embalming station where his tools had been neatly arranged, only to find the instruments scattered across the floor. The scalpel lay closest, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light. As he reached for it, the room filled with the sound of laughter, low, cruel, and inhuman. A gust of icy wind slammed into him, extinguishing the match in his hand. Suddenly, the faint meow of a cat broke the tension. Victor spun around to see a black feline perched on the edge of the slab, its eyes glowing like embers. It hissed violently, its back arching as it stared past him. Victor turned to follow its gaze, and the room seemed to shift, the walls bending inward as if the space itself were alive. Victor. The voice was unmistakable this time. It was Clara's, soft, melodic, yet tinged with an unnatural edge. He turned slowly, his breath catching as he saw her standing in the doorway. Her hair fell in tangled waves over her pale shoulders, her eyes glistening with an unholy light. She smiled, but it wasn't the warm, loving smile he remembered. This was something else, feral, predatory. "You came back." His voice cracked, tears streaming down his face as he stepped toward her. "I knew you would. I knew our love was stronger than death." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You promised me eternity, Victor," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally, overlapping with the ringing of a distant church bell. "Will you keep that promise?" "Yes, anything," he cried, dropping to his knees before her. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing his cheek. The touch sent a jolt through him, as if her very presence drained the warmth from his body. "Then give me all of you," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. The sound of glass breaking punctuated her words as the room plunged into chaos. The embalming equipment flew from the shelves, crashing to the floor in a cacophony of metallic clangs and shattering glass. The storm outside intensified, the roar of thunder shaking the foundation of the building. Victor's head swam, his vision blurring as her fingers dug into his shoulders. "Anything," he murmured, his voice weak, his body trembling. She smiled again, leaning closer. Her breath was cold against his neck as she whispered, "Then let me take what's mine." Before he could respond, she lunged forward, her teeth sinking into his chest. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a searing agony that spread through his body as blood poured from the wound. He screamed, the sound echoing through the mortuary, mingling with the scream of the wind and the groan of creaking wood. Clara's laughter filled the room, a chilling, inhuman sound that drowned out everything else. Victor fell to the floor, clutching his neck as the blood pooled around him. His vision dimmed, but he could still see her standing over him, her eyes glowing brighter now, her smile impossibly wide. As his life slipped away, he realized the truth. Clara hadn't come back for love. She had come back to feed. As Victor's vision faded to black, his body slackening against the cold, blood-soaked floor, the mortuary fell eerily silent, save for the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. But then, the air stirred with a haunted breath, a low rasp echoing in the stillness. Clara's figure bent down, her head cocked unnaturally as if listening to something distant. "Oh, Victor," she murmured, her voice dripping with mockery. "Did you think I came back alone?" A sudden bang, followed by the clatter of chains rattling against the wall. Clara stood, her smile widening grotesquely as a spooky lullaby began to play faintly, distorted and off-key, from nowhere and everywhere. The chimes of a clock striking midnight reverberated through the air as the storm outside reached its climax, with thunder cracking and the howl of wolves echoing in the distance. From the shadows, another figure emerged, distorted, writhing, its form a mass of shifting darkness. The air turned icy as distant screams filled the mortuary, mingling with the hiss of wind through broken windows. "Victor," Clara said softly, kneeling beside his lifeless body, her voice barely audible over the low drone noise that had begun to hum in the background. "You gave me everything, but I was never yours to keep." She turned her gaze toward the shadowy figure, her laughter rising, cruel and resonant. The figure extended a long skeletal hand toward Victor's corpse, and for a brief moment his eyes snapped open, wide with terror. From beneath him, the crackling of fire erupted as the floor seemed to collapse into a swirling void of darkness. His scream, piercing and raw, was cut off by the slam of a metal door, leaving only the faint whistling of wind and the distant cry of children. The last sound to echo in the room was a subtle buzzing like static before everything fell deathly silent. But in the silence, a faint whisper emerged, echoing unnaturally as if from within the walls. "Love is eternal, Victor, and so is the feast." The faint scraping of metal broke the silence, sharp and deliberate, as if someone was dragging a blade across stone. Victor's body twitched again, but this time the movement was unmistakable. His head jerked violently to the side and his eyes snapped open, clouded but alive with something far from human. The haunted breathing in the room deepened, accompanied by reverberating footsteps that seemed to circle him. The blade's sound grew louder, knife sharpening now, rhythmic and unrelenting as Clara emerged from the shadows holding a long, gleaming carving knife. The thunder cracked outside, illuminating the mortuary in a flash of blinding light, and for an instant Victor saw them. Others, dozens of figures, decayed and grinning, lining the room. The distant screams began again, rising and falling like a macabre chorus as Clara bent over him, her grin widening. "You didn't think this was the end, did you?" she cooed, her voice dripping with mockery. From outside, the sound of eerie wind chimes mingled with the hiss of wind and the faint, distant cries of children. Suddenly, a door slammed violently, and the knife in Clara's hand began to hum as if alive, vibrating with an unnatural energy. She raised it high, her voice now blending with echoing whispers and the chime of a distant bell. But before the blade could descend, Victor's lips parted, and a guttural voice emerged, not his own. "This body is mine now," it growled, a sound that echoed with the weight of countless voices. The creaking floorboards beneath him groaned as his limbs moved with an inhuman speed, his hand gripping Clara's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor with a sudden bang. From the darkness, a low drone began to hum, growing louder and more oppressive as Victor sat upright, his movements jerky and unnatural. Clara's grin faltered for the first time, replaced by wide-eyed terror as he whispered, "The feast isn't over. It's just begun." Then, with a snap of his fingers, the room plunged into complete silence, broken only by the faint sound of chains rattling in the distance. The air in the room was heavy, suffocating, a mixture of damp decay and something unnameable, something ancient. Victor's eyes, now dark voids reflecting no light, surveyed the room as if taking in the boundaries of his new reality. The faint sound of a clock ticking in the distance began to echo louder, a rhythm in tune with the shallow breathing that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Victor," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but defiant, "this isn't you." Her words seemed to falter against the oppressive darkness as chains began rattling in the distance, the sound growing closer with each beat of the clock. "This body is mine," he growled, his voice a chorus of overlapping tones, human and inhuman. A sudden bang reverberated through the room as the door slammed shut of its own accord. The floor beneath Clara's feet creaked, an ominous groan that sent her heart racing. The knife lay at her feet, vibrating, its unearthly hum a counterpoint to the growing tension. As she bent to retrieve it, the distant cries of children pierced the air. followed by the unsettling chime of a distorted music box playing a fractured lullaby. "Do you think you can stop what's coming?" Victor's voice mocked her, the words seeming to come from every corner of the room. Clara tightened her grip on the knife, its vibrating blade emitting a low drone that harmonized with the ghostly whispers now circling her. "I'll stop you," Clara hissed, raising the blade. Thunder cracked, illuminating Victor for a split second. His face was no longer his. It was a shifting canvas of horrors, faces of the long dead, their mouths open in silent screams. The lightning flash was followed by the growling of wind and the eerie sound of unseen footsteps circling Clara. "Stop me?" Victor chuckled darkly, his voice blending with the rattling chains and the distant tolling of a church bell. "You're just like the others, a pawn in a game you can't comprehend." Suddenly, the ground beneath Clara seemed to shift, a low rumble accompanied by the creaking of ancient wood. She stumbled, catching herself on a table covered in dust and strange symbols carved deep into its surface. Blood began to drip from somewhere above, the soft patter adding to the cacophony of terror around her. Victor stepped forward, his movements unnatural, as if marionette strings pulled him. "The feast must continue," he murmured, reaching out a hand that seemed to ripple and distort like smoke. Clara screamed, her voice cutting through the noise as she plunged the knife forward. The blade connected, but instead of resistance, there was a sickening squelch, and Victor laughed, a guttural sound that reverberated through her chest. "You can't kill what's already dead," he whispered. The walls began to bleed, dark crimson trails running like tears as the sound of scraping metal grew louder, sharper. Clara backed away, but her foot caught on something, a skeletal hand reaching from beneath the floorboards. She fell, landing hard as a door creaked open behind her, revealing nothing but a void of black. Victor stood over her, his smile widening unnaturally. "This is only the beginning," he said as the knife in Clara's hand began to hum louder, its vibrations becoming almost unbearable. Then, with a sudden blinding flash of light and a deafening roar, everything went silent. The room was empty, save for Clara, now alone, clutching the knife. The door behind her slammed shut, and the faint sound of chains dragging echoed in the distance. She stood trembling, her reflection in the blade showing not her own face but Victor's, his grin still mocking her. The knife whispered to her, its voice low and insistent. "It's your turn now," it said. The story ends, but the feast begins anew. Who will be next? The knife's hum started again, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to resonate with the walls themselves, each beat louder than the last. Clara staggered backward, her breathing ragged and punctuated by the distant cries of children echoing from the void beyond the locked door. The air was dense, thick with static buzzing, as if an unseen current coursed through the room. From somewhere behind her, the unmistakable sound of a blade dragging across stone returned, louder this time, sharper. The scraping sent shivers down her spine, and she spun around to face the darkness. "Victor?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the low drone noise that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere all at once. A sudden bang shattered the uneasy stillness, and the sound of unseen footsteps approached, deliberate and slow. The reverberating footsteps stopped mere inches from her, and Clara froze, unable to turn, unable to move, as if something unseen held her in place. The creak of stairs came next, faint but growing louder, as if someone or something was descending into the room. Thunder cracked outside, illuminating the space once more, and in the flash of light she saw them. Faces, disembodied, floating just beyond the edges of the room's shadows. Their mouths moved in unison, but the only sound that followed was the haunting chime of bells and a low growl from deep within the void. Clara raised the knife instinctively, its edge now glowing faintly, casting a cold, pale light across the blood-streaked walls. "This ends here," she muttered, though the words rang hollow even to her. A faint laugh echoed from behind her, soft at first, then growing into a cacophony of ghostly laughter that filled the room. The laughter was joined by chains rattling and the hiss of wind slipping through unseen cracks. But then, a sudden silence fell. The oppressive quiet pressed against her ears, deafening in its absence of sound, save for the slow, deliberate sharpening of a blade coming from the shadows. The faint creak of floorboards signaled something, or someone, was moving closer. "Clara," a voice whispered, low and guttural, barely human, "you're too late." Her reflection in the knife's blade changed again, but it wasn't Victor this time. It was her own face, twisted into a grin far too wide, her eyes void of humanity. The image moved independently, speaking words she had not yet thought. "You've always been part of this," it hissed, just as a door slammed somewhere behind her. In that moment, the clock struck midnight, each chime resonating through the room with a thunderous echo. Victor, or what was left of him, stepped from the shadows, his form now grotesque, his features shifting between countless faces. "This isn't the end, Clara," he said, his voice layered with countless others. "This is your beginning." Before she could react, the knife in her hand began to pull away, twisting in her grip as if alive. Her reflection spoke again, this time with Victor's voice. "The feast requires more than just a host. It needs a willing participant." The blade turned in her hand, and with a final scream, the room went dark. In the silence that followed, a faint music box began to play, its haunting melody mingling with the distant sound of fire crackling. Outside, a wolf howled, and from the void, the scraping of metal started once more. The mortuary seemed alive with its own malignant intent. Clara gripped the knife, its vibration faint but constant, as if waiting for the right moment to unleash its dormant power. The room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint sound of chains dragging somewhere deep within the shadows. Victor, or the thing wearing his body, stood motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle as if listening to voices only he could hear. "Do you feel it?" His voice was a grotesque mix of his own and something ancient, guttural and resonant. The words echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls as though the room itself hungered for sound. "The knife doesn't belong to you, Clara. It never did. It chooses who wields it." Clara steadied her breathing, ignoring the reverberating footsteps that seemed to circle her. "I'm not afraid of you," she spat, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Outside, thunder cracked, illuminating the decayed faces pressed against the mortuary's windows. Their eyeless sockets seemed to stare directly at her, and she turned away, gripping the knife tighter. Victor stepped closer, the floor creaking with each deliberate move. "Not afraid?" His lips twisted into a parody of a smile. "Then why are your hands trembling?" He reached out, his fingers impossibly long and clawed, brushing against the edge of the knife. The sound of metal scraping against bone filled the room, a nauseating symphony that made Clara's stomach churn. Suddenly, the knife's vibrations ceased. A low drone hummed in the air as if the mortuary itself was holding its breath. Clara lunged, the blade slicing through the darkness, but Victor caught her wrist mid-swing, his grip like iron. "You think this will save you?" he whispered, his face inches from hers. "This isn't a weapon, it's a key." Before she could react, the knife began to glow, casting a sickly green light that pulsed in time with her racing heartbeat. A sharp metallic clicking sound filled the air as the walls around them began to shift, the mortuary warping into something unrecognizable. Chains rattled overhead, and from the shadows, the decayed figures began to move, their grotesque grins widening.
Clara yanked her arm free and stumbled back, the knife still clutched in her hand. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice cracking as the figures closed in, their footsteps synchronized and deliberate.
Victor laughed, the sound echoing with a chilling resonance. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "You're the one who unlocked the door."
The floor beneath them splintered, and Clara screamed as she fell into darkness, the wind howling around her. She landed hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the mortuary. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the faint sound of children crying echoed in the distance. Victor stood above her, his form now fully monstrous.
His eyes burned with an unholy fire, and his body twisted and contorted as if it could barely contain the power surging within him. "Welcome to the feast," he said, his voice a cacophony of overlapping tones.
Clara scrambled to her feet, the knife her only solace.
"This isn't over," she said, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her.
Victor smiled, his teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light.
"Now," he agreed, "it's just beginning."
From the shadows, a new figure emerged, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. It held a blade identical to Clara's, its edges dripping with an otherworldly ichor.
"2 keys, the figure said, its voice soft yet commanding. Only 1 door.
The sound of a clock striking midnight filled the air, followed by the distant toll of a church bell. Clara tightened her grip on the knife, her resolve hardening. Whatever this was, she wouldn't go down without a fight. As the hooded figure stepped closer, the ground beneath them began to quake, and the air filled with the deafening cacophony of chains rattling, doors slamming, and glass shattering. The final twist came with a low, guttural growl that echoed from the void.
It wasn't Victor, or the hooded figure. It was something far older, far hungrier, waiting just beyond the edges of reality.
And it had just been awakened.